This is my diagnosis of a 1991 Volkswagen Westfalia Vanagon. It has a Subaru conversion kit, so Subaru engine, wiring, computer, and all that. They've made it a water-cooled engine. It's got plumbing for the cooling system now. Pretty slick setup. I think it's been around for a while. And there's a carb exemption label for smog. Pre-1996, meaning this vehicle is OBD1. Thing about that is back in the day, when in the 90s, when you were a technician not at a dealer independent shop type setup, you would have very few scan tools to be able to talk to this vehicle in the 90s. So there's a lot of technicians that quit the industry because of the new emerging technology and new learning curve for communicating with scan tools and reading that data as well. Fuel trims, sensor data, it was a whole new world. Okay, so I ended up finding the Subaru engine computer for this van under the back seat cushion, lifted it up, and found it in this black box. Those connectors you see there are diagnostics. So this connector is the actual data line connector for the Subaru scan tool the dealer would have used back in the day. Black one, I believe, was for if you connect it, you get codes to flash. Green, I think, clears the codes, but look up service information. Making this video way after. So key on, engine off, I hooked up one of the connectors and I'm flashing codes, and I ended up looking up the service information for the code sequence, and I got code 32. Code 32 is oxygen sensor malfunction. At this point, I wanted to be able to read things like fuel trim, injector pulse width time, O2 sensor signal without probing every single sensor and guessing. So at that point, there's two options I found. EvoScan in New Zealand makes compatible connector for this vehicle, and it plugs into a modern laptop, which is nice, using their proprietary software you're going to see in a sec here. So this software, EvoScan, I'm using, I think, 2.6 version. It's USB based, not a lot of complexity. It was hard to get the program to work, and you need to be a little bit computer savvy to get that to work. It's not plug and play, at least not in my experience. So I can start logging data, has like graphing features, really slick. And there was a little bit of lag, but I think there's a couple things in EvoScan that maybe weren't popping up, but I didn't use it a whole lot. I ended up using the second option, which was an open source old program to talk directly with the Subaru computer, and it uses the old printer port on it. So I ordered a 25-year-old laptop, Windows XP, I think it was, with the old printer port, and I made, using a Amazon printer port cable I ordered, modified that end to plug into a a radio connector that just happens to fit the Subaru connector that you saw earlier in the video. And at that point, soldered the wires together. There's only 3 needed. There's a whole write-up in a forum. Just search Subaru diagnostic software, GNU, I think it's called. But somebody created the software years ago, and it's a great program. Now it runs on a BIOS, so you have to know more about computers to use this system here that I'm using. Again, you can probably try and get it to work with a modern laptop. I think that was an option, but it just seems simpler for me to order an older laptop and run it on boot up, which is, I'm using a CD drive in the laptop to do that. So at this point, I can see data now. I can clear codes. I can see the ROM ID. I can see pretty much everything the factory scan tool would have seen back in the 90s on this particular engine. Now, the complaint is a stalling issue. I've noticed cold start, hot start, doesn't matter. It's always idling up and down rough. I did a relative compression test. It was fine. In a minute here, you'll see more, but I have to ask myself, is the oxygen sensor causing it to stall out? You'll see in a sec here, the oxygen sensor voltage is reading at 0.05, basically full lean most of the time at idle. I'll add fuel and it goes up. So I don't think it's a bad oxygen sensor. It's responding to fuel and it's responding to a vacuum leak. Now, also it's modified, so I've noticed for some reason Japanese cars oxygen sensor readings at idle don't always happen until you start, revving the engine up or having it in gear. So for whatever reason, the O2 sensor rating, really wasn't telling me it had a bad oxygen sensor. Everything tested okay. I wasn't worried about the low voltage at idle. I don't have another one to compare it to, but there was no warning light on. He didn't have a check engine light on. Now, I did disturb the connector before I made the scan tool and plugged in. So did I fix a bad connection? Possibly. But again, there was no check engine light. It was just a stored O2 sensor code. And you see right here, I'm looking at the baro sensor for one, but I really want to look at fuel trim and I want to look at idle air control. So injector pulse width as well. So it's idling rough right now. You can't see it, but the engine's shaking. My idle air control is at 28%. It doesn't indicate a vacuum leak. If it had a vacuum leak, like any vehicle, it should be at like 0%. If it's affecting the idle that much, and the fuel trims should be adding quite a bit of fuel. The fuel trim's really low, 3%. That right there tells me I don't have a vacuum leak, but I smoked it just to make sure. So what are we losing at idle? We're either losing compression, air, or fuel, spark. So really 4 things. Losing compression, you could be losing the air, which I guess would go and coincide with compression, and then fuel or spark. Now, I did check the spark. The spark was on the picoscope. The coil pack was showing a strong spark line, KV, everything looked good. It was indicating air-fuel ratio imbalance, and I can add that in a second video if anyone wants that type of reading. But so I know it's air-fuel related. My vacuum gauge is not erratic, so I don't think it's a sticky exhaust valve on some cylinders or something causing an EGR-like effect to make it a rough idle. Now here I'm testing the O2 sensor. That's the reading off idle and idle. I'm also spraying starting fluid in the intake, and it's immediately responding like I said earlier in the video. And this signal matches the laptop scan tool signal. So the computer is seeing the correct oxygen sensor voltage. At this point, I don't think we're losing spark. I don't think it's weak spark because it runs great off idle. I don't think it's a sticky or worn out exhaust valve causing exhaust gases to dilute the cylinders. I don't think it's anything like that. The indication to me is going to be fuel at this point. Now, I need to check fuel pressure. Well, can't look at the factory Volkswagen spec because obviously it's going to be a different specification because it's a different fuel system somewhat. So fuel pressure, you see was okay here, but always take a sample, and this is why. It actually has water in the fuel, and the water was what was causing it to stall out. It ended up collecting in the fuel rails and spraying water in the cylinders at idle, and it would run better the more you ran it because that water is mixing and getting pushed out of the fuel rail, and then it'll sit or slow down and idle, and it collects more in the fuel rails and idle like crap again. But always look for contaminated fuel as the source of your drivability issue. Definitely don't have good fuel.